Hello, Edward here from 088. In this session, we're going to be talking about queue stack fundamentals. So, all of the different things that we need to do when it comes to actually building a list or a stack of queues. So, by queue stack, we mean basically just having multiple queues on a single playback on your console. Any console running Xeros can have multiple queues stored onto any playback. So let's take a look. On my screen here, I'm running Phantom Xeros. Phantom Xeros allows you to emulate any console running the Xeros software. So in this case here, I'm actually emulating a FLX console. That's what we can see here. On the left-hand side of my screen, well, that's what we can see if you've got an external monitor connected to your console. If you're using a Flex S24, you won't have an external monitor output, but you're going to be able to do pretty much all of what we can do here today anyway, because you could still build queue stacks and view queue stacks on the internal touchscreen. Top right of my screen here, I've got capture visualization software running. That's talking to my Phantom Xeros here so that we can see the lights that we're controlling. So we can see those changes as we go through. So let's dive in and take a look. So as I mentioned, any playback you can store queues onto, and by queue we mean a lighting state. So I have a lighting state, I have a single queue on my fader here. Let's go in and program some queues and start to build up a queue stack. So I'm going to go in and I'm actually going to do some really basic lighting states to start off with. I'm going to just go and push up some faders. I'm going to go and make those red. And now I've done that, I'm going to record that as a queue. So I'm going to go and press my record button on the console. And now any empty playbacks are going to flash away at you. And that's going to say that you can record this lighting state that's on stage right now onto any of these empty playbacks. And I'm actually going to go and store this onto my master playback. Now, if you're not aware, the master playback is just an extra playback that we have available to us. On the left-hand side of our console, we have our faders that can either be channels or with the press of a button, they can be playbacks. And so we, as well as these playbacks, have an extra master playback. And the main reason that's there is for if you've got just a single queue stack that you're running for your show. Saving you having to go to playbacks, find the page, and then use a little button and a single fader up here, you have a dedicated fader that you can use. The functionality of this fader, though, is no different. Fundamentally, it's no different to any of the other playbacks. So everything that we do on our master here, you can apply that same logic to your other playbacks over here. Now, at the moment, I'm viewing my queue list window. If you've got an external desktop, bottom half of your queues desktop will be the queues window. And I can view any queue list, any queue stack, in my queues window. To do that, press and hold the view button and tap a playback button. And as you do that, you'll see your little window header here. That will change to show you a different queue list, a different playback that you're viewing. So press and hold view, you can then tap a button of a playback that you wish to view. So if I press and hold view, tap my master playbacks button, I can see that I'm now viewing the master playback. And at the moment, the master playback has a single queue on it. This time, I'm going to have these fixtures dropping down to 50%. So I could have used the faders for that, but I actually used a little bit of syntax at 50 enter. And I'm now going to make these blue. And I'm now going to tap record, but this time I'm going to tap that playbacks button again. And that then automatically stores that in as queue number 2. Now, if you tap record and then go and tap the button of one of the other playbacks on your console, so I'm going to go and click playback button number 2 here that isn't flashing, The reason it wasn't flashing is because there was something on there already, and I will therefore get this pop-up appear. And essentially saying, well, there's something on this playback already, what do you want to do? And so you've got some options in here, and one of those is create Q2. So that's how you can build a queue stack onto one of the playbacks on the left-hand side of your console. I'm going to click cancel though, because for now we're going to continue building this on our master playback. So I've gone and double tapped clear there. Double tapping clear, that's going to firstly clear the selection of lights and then clear any manual values that might be present. That's now going to allow me to go in on my master playback, raise it, and I go into Q1. And you can see there that I'm now in Q1, and that's indicated by the green row. That means it's the queue I'm in. My button, if you program multiple queues onto a playback, the button will automatically be configured to be a go button for you. And that means that when I press go, I'm going to go into whichever queue is highlighted in yellow. And so in my case here, if I press my go button, I will go into Q2. If you've got an external monitor, you also have your useful playback status information here to show you that, yep, currently you're in Q1, that's the green one, and the next queue is Q2, the yellow one. And so if I press my go button, then yep, instead I see the next queue outputting on stage. So I press record and I pressed my playbacks button to store that queue. If you press record and then tap a playbacks button, that will record that lighting state in the next available queue in the playback that you've pressed the button of. This time though, I'm actually going to go and say that I want these lights. Let's go and pull all of these faders down for now. I'm then going to go back to channels and I'm now going to say I want those two lights and these two lights, and let's have those in a azure, and because they're moving lights I'm actually going to put them to pointing down stage, and I'm going to tap record, but this time rather than tapping the go button I'm going to press enter. Now if you do record enter rather than record and a playback button, record enter will stick that in as the next available queue in the currently viewed playback. So if I do record enter now, it's going to record that queue into the master playback because that's the one I'm currently viewing. If I went and viewed a different playback and now did a record enter, it again just stores it into the playback that I'm currently viewing. I'm going to go back and view my master playback. Press and hold view, tap your master playbacks button. Adding in a step to that, this time let's have these fixtures in a new position. Let's go something like that. And I'm going to actually stick those in a colour. Something like that. This time I'm going to tap record, but now I'm actually going to define the queue number I want. By default, if you go record enter or record playback button, it's just going in as the next whole available queue number. But if I tap record, I can now type the queue number that I want. If you're on FLX consoles, you can tap your Z button, which will be just over here. Tap Z, that will allow you on your on-screen number pad to type in the queue you want. If you're on Flex, well, you've got a dedicated number pad anyway. So I could right now go and say record 5, and now press enter to record Q5 in the currently viewed playback. Or I could do record 5 and then tap a playback button to store this lighting state as Q5 onto that particular playback. So in my case, I could do record 5 enter, or I could do record 5 and tap my master playbacks button. I'm actually going to go and say record 5 and tap my master playbacks button. And that has now stored it in as Q5, not Q4, stored it in as Q5 into that master playback. Personally, when I'm programming, I like to always use the record and then tap the playback button rather than record enter. Because remember, record enter is purely dependent on what playback you're currently viewing. Whereas record and tap a playback's button, you know that cue is going directly onto that playback. But it's personal preference. So we've ended up now with loads of different cues. Various cues here. And I can press my go button to run through these. But you might not have a clue what actually each cue is going to do. And that is because I haven't yet named these cues. If you want to name a cue, you can double click onto that cue in the cues window. And that will allow you to give it a name. My cue. As well as naming the cue by double tapping, if you're on the full-size Flex console, you have a name button, and that allows you to do name syntax. If I wanted to name Q5 right now, I could use the syntax on the full-size Flex as name 5 and then tap the playback button. And that allows me to name cue number 5 of the playback I tapped. Cue names can either be a description of your lighting state, or probably more commonly in theatrical lighting, it will actually be the point in the script which requires that cue to be triggered. If you're on the full-size Flex, something else you can do, and this time let's have, I'm going to double tap enter. If you double tap enter, that will select any fixtures that are currently on above 0. I'm going to then make these in white. Let's have those a little bit brighter. Let's have something like that. Let's warm it up a touch. And we'll have those in our centre stage position again. And this time, I know I want to call this backlight, for example. And so I could actually go and say record 6 name. And if you use the syntax record, type the cue and then tap name, I can then call this, for example, backlight, hit enter, and that cue gets stored in with your custom name this time. Great stuff. And so I can have, as we've seen now, I can begin to run my cues back. I'm running Phantom Zeros. If you're using Phantom Zeros or you're using a USB keyboard plugged into your console, you can use the spacebar as the master playback's go button. That's what I'm doing here. And I can now run through my different cues and see those outputting. Now, something you will have seen happening here, we've talked about the cue number, we've talked about the name, we've then got all of these values here. And these are the cue times. So every cue you program will have fade times associated to it. The first cue in a playback will have no intensity fade times. A 0-second fade for up and a 0-second fade for down. And that is because the intensity is not being affected by a fade time, it's being affected by the fader only. So it means that I can push that fader up, my lights come on. But now subsequent cues will use the default fade time on the console, and the default is 3 seconds. If you wish to change the cue defaults, you can press the setup key on your console, go to defaults, and in here you will have your cue timing defaults. And as you can see, fade up and fade down defaults to 3 seconds. But I could click on there and edit that if I wanted, and any future cues would then use the new time. I'm going to tap setup again to come out of there. So if I wish, I can edit any of these times now that I've recorded my cue. So when I press my go button to go from 1 to 2, we have our lights fading down. Therefore, the timing we're interested in is our downtime. And I might want to adjust that. To adjust your fade time, you can double click and type in the cue you need, the time you need, or when you're hovered over these windows, you can actually use your encoder wheels. And I could go in and use my encoder wheels right now to adjust my timings. Each click of the encoder wheel will increment by a second, so if you need to be more specific, you can click the middle button of that encoder, and that will bring up an on-screen number pad. And I might want to actually say that this is a 5.5 second fade. And so this time, I'm going to press my go button, and any lights that have to fade down when I press go will be adhering to that fade down time. Now, because there are no lights fading up when I press go, my fade up time is actually pointless. The fade up time will only affect lights that are raising in intensity when you press go. So right now that time is actually not being used by the cue, because when I go from Q1 to Q2, when I do that transition, lights are only fading down. And so for that transition, only the downtime is being used. If I press my go button now, I have lights fading down and I have lights fading up. So both of these times are going to be important to me for that particular transition. If you want the lights fading up to take the same amount of time as the lights fading down, you can use your first encoder, which will be simply labelled fade. If you adjust that encoder, you'll notice how you adjust both times together. The lights fading down will take the same amount of time as those that are fading up. Now, you'll notice that we had our fade up, we had our fade down, and we've also got delays. So for every fade time, there is also a delay time. So I could actually say, okay, well, the fixtures that are fading up, I want to have a delay. And so I'm going to go and click on that button, and I'm going to actually go and say that they're going to have a 5-second delay time. In your cue list window, you will then get the delay time in brackets. Let's watch this through. I'm going to go into cue number 2. And when I'm in Q2, I'm now going to press my go button to go into Q3. Lights fading down are going to take 4 seconds. And after the delay time, my lights will then fade up. And so it looked like there were actually two cues running there on stage. But it was just because, firstly, my lights faded down. After the delay time, my lights then faded up. Now, you may have noticed, also in your playback status down the bottom here, you have your progress bars. And so you saw there during those transitions that progress bar running through. And that top progress bar there is our intensity. But what about the other progress bars? Well, the other progress bars are for your attribute fade times. And your attributes are colour, beam, shape and position. So let's talk about those. First of all, colour. When I raise my fader here, the console is saying that the colour of my fixtures is going to take 3 seconds to get from whatever those lights are doing right now to the programmed colour. And you'll notice there, they faded from white. And that's because by default, your fixtures will be white. That's how that when you push a fader up, your light comes on in white and not a different colour. And so that's what we're seeing with that time. So actually for this particular application, I'm going to get rid of that fade so that when I raise my fader, my fixtures are already in the colour that I need. When I press go, I can now see that it's going to take the colour 3 seconds to get from whatever colour they were in to the colour that's programmed into that cue. Beam, shape and position were blank, and that's because these cues have no beam, shape or position parameters recorded in them, and therefore there's no fade time applicable. This cue has position information. And so if I press my go button now, there's position information present. But notice we don't see a position fade happen. These fixtures have already moved to this location. We didn't see them move to get to this location, we just simply saw their intensity raise. That's because of something called move on dark. And what that means is that whenever your fixture goes to 0% in a cue list, or cue stack, the console will then read ahead. It's going to look at your future cues, and it's going to go, right, okay, well, further down the cue stack, that fixture is needed in this colour, in this beam, in this shape, in this position. And the console prepares that light ready for when it's used. Whenever the console is preparing fixtures, that's where you will see a black 0 with a grey background, meaning that that fixture has been prepared for you. That's what that information in your output window means. It means that that fixture has been moved on dark for you. For Q5, I'm going to press my go button, and notice there is no intensity fade time this time. And that's because the only thing that happened when I went from Q3 into Q5, when I did that transition, there is no intensity information changing. There's just the colour changing and the position changing. That is also actually indicated by the colour of that intensity percentage. We're now seeing a purple value. If you see a purple value, it means that light's intensity has not been told to change, and it's therefore just doing what it was doing in the previous cue. You'll notice that your intensities are blue if they're coming from a cue. If they fade down, they'll be green. The little way of remembering that is blue is fading up towards the sky, green fading down towards the grass. That's a little way of remembering it. So that's what we're seeing with these colours here. Green are fading down, blue are any values that are fading up. Like our intensities, our attributes also have delays available. So I can actually say, well, I want the fixtures to change colour, and then I want them to move in this cue. Well, in that case, I can actually go and stick a delay time. So I'm going to actually go and say that I want there to be a 3-second delay on the position, but still a 3-second fade. And that will mean this time when I press go, the fixtures are going to change colour over 3 seconds, and then the movement will happen after that delay time has run through. So you can start to get pretty creative with all of these various timings that we've got available to us. Now, if you know, for example, that here's my Q6. If I know, right, I know that Q7 is going to be a snap blackout. Well, I could record the cue with those fade times all at once. So I'm going to go and say that I'm going to go and pull my master playback fader down to give myself a blackout, and I'm now going to record this blackout, and you'll notice that when you press record, your fade times, your encoder wheels, sorry, will display your fade times. If you don't adjust them, your fade times will be recorded into that cue with the console defaults, but instead I can actually use my encoder wheels to set the timing. Now, on some consoles, you have a dedicated time key. So you could say, record time 5 enter, for example, to give a fade time of 5 seconds. Well, we don't need it on Flex, because we could actually use that middle encoder button, and we could use the syntax record, click the middle encoder, say the fade time you need. I'm actually going to say 0 for a snap. Hit enter to insert that fade time, and I can then tap my master playbacks button to store that in. And I then record that cue with that custom fade time already in place. So I'm going to click on Q6. I'm going to then raise my fader to go into Q6. And I can now press my go button and I snap to black because I recorded my blackout cue with that 0-second fade time. Great stuff. So that is our fade times that we've got available to us as well. Now, a very common thing that you might come across is there's my Q1, this is my Q2, but you realise, before Q2, I just need to add a lighting state in. I need to insert a cue between Q1 and 2. Well, don't worry, we can indeed do that. Let's say that between Q1 and 2, I want just my middle pair of fixtures to be on. So I'm going to go and use my faders to take out lights 1, 2, 9 and 10. I did that by raising the channel fader to the level that light was currently at and then lowering it to 0. And so what I've got on stage now, this is what I want to go, this lighting state here, I want this to go between Q1 and 2. So I'm now going to record that, and I'm going to say record. And remember, if you tap your playback button, that would just go in as the next available whole cue. So this would be going in as a Q8 right now. So instead, I need to define the cue number that I want to record. So I can actually say record 1.5. If you're on FLX, again, tap your Z button and you'll be able to use the on-screen number pad to type in that particular cue number. So I'm going to say record 1.5. Exactly like any normal cue, I can now set the fade times of that cue on my encoder wheels if I want to. And then you can go and tap that your playbacks button to record that in as cue 1.5 onto your playback. And there we go. I now have a cue 1.5. There's my cue 1. There's my cue 1.5. And there's my cue 2, exactly how I had it. And so that is how we can insert a cue. So I've just named that as a 1.5. You can actually record to 2 decimal places. So you can record a 1.99 if you needed to. The reason I went slap bang in the middle there is to give me the most amount of room. This now allows me to insert a gain if I need to, between 1.5 and 2, or 1.5 and 1. If I'd recorded that as 1.01, well, I'd have actually had to then move that cue to free up a bit of space to then insert a gain if I needed to. So always insert your cues with a number directly in between your cues if you need to. So I've recorded that as a 1.5. Now, as well as inserting cues, we can, of course, update cues. And so I could actually say that, let's say, Q6. Let's say in my Q6 here, I needed to actually add in, what should we do? What should we add into this? Let's add in a little bit of cyc light. So I'm going to go into my groups and I'm going to actually go and grab my cyc lights and I'm going to put them in a blue. I'm actually going to go and dim those down a touch. So I'm going to tap Z to go to my intensity wheel and just bring the intensity down a little bit. Great, I'm now happy. What's on stage right now, I now want this to be stored in as Q6. So I need to update Q6 with this information. And I can literally just tap update and then tap my playbacks button. Notice at the point of pressing update, I can also set my fade times if I wish to on the encoder wheels. So I can also update the fade times at the point of updating the cue as well. But I'm just going to press update and I'm going to tap my master playbacks button. And notice how those values changed from red intensity percentages, meaning manual values, they've automatically changed from red to blue, meaning they're now stored in the cue. And so I can now pull my fader down. There's my Q1. I'm now going to go straight into Q6, click on it, press go, and there's my updated cue with my sight lighting added in. Now by default, when you update cues, by default you will only affect the cue you are working on. So you'll notice here, if I now go into Q7, yep, Q7 is indeed still a blackout. However, if you want to make a change to multiple cues, you can update a cue with tracking enabled. Now, I'm not going to go in too in-depth in tracking. We've got a whole session dedicated on the record options and another one dedicated session on tracking. So go and check those out if you're interested. But basically it means that if I wanted to add in like 11 and 16, for example, so I'm going to go and say 11 and 16 at. That's these side lights here. I'll tell you what, let's add in 15 and 20. Might be able to see them a little bit better. 15 and 20 are side light here. If I just went update and then hit enter, by default you will only add them in to the cue you're working on. I'm going to press go, they then turn back off. But if I turn them on, I go update, and if you press and hold update, that will open your update options in the internal touchscreen. If I then went and chose track forwards and then press my go button, that has now added those lights in to all of my subsequent cues until those lights are given a new instruction. Well, none of my cues have an instruction for those lights, and so they track through all of those subsequent cues. So that's something that might catch you out, because you might end up with lights on in cues you don't want them in, but it can also be a real time saver, because I've now very quickly added those lights into multiple cues. If I want to repair my blackout, I could now go and turn those lights back off. So you can either go and find their fader and bring them down to 0, or I'm actually going to use the syntax @dot to turn those off. And I can now go and say update, tap my playback button again to repair that cue again. And that's to do with tracking. Tracking is a tool that allows you to edit multiple cues at once. But by default, you will have cue only enabled. And that means you will only affect the cue that you're working on. So that's updating cues. Something else that we can do is copy cues. So let's see. Let's say, yeah, Q6 here. I really like Q6. I'm going to use that later on. Maybe I'm going to need that as cue number 10. Well, I can copy cue number 6 and paste it in as cue number 10. To do that, go to your copy button, press copy, and you can literally type in the cue number you want to copy from. So I'm going to say Q6, press enter, and I'm going to say I want to paste this in as Q10 and press enter. And notice I've copied Q6 to 10, it's copied everything. It's copied the fade times and the name as well. I can go to my blackout, I can go to my Q10, and that is indeed an exact copy and paste of Q6. So that's how we can copy our queues. You can also copy multiple queues. So I could go and say, and this is only if you're on Flex, worth mentioning. I could go and say that I want to copy queue 1 through 3 and paste them to queue 11. And so I can copy that range of queues and paste them in further down my queue stack if you wish to. And that was by using the through command within copying. So that's copying. Something else we can do, of course, is deleting, which is always useful to know. If you tap your delete button, any playbacks that you have programmed will be flashing away at you. If I were to go and tap my master playbacks button, that's going to say delete stack. And that is indeed asking me, do I want to delete this whole stack of queues? And no, I do not want to do that. I just want to get rid of queue 11.5, for example. Well, if I want to just get rid of that particular queue, I can tap delete and then type in the queue number I want to get rid of. So I can actually say delete 11.5. And again, if you're on FlexS, tap delete, tap your Z button. That will allow you to type in that queue number. So I'm going to say delete 11.5 and I'm going to tap my master playbacks button. And that's telling the console that I want to delete queue number 11.5 from the playback that I have pressed. The console will then say, are you sure you want to delete queue 0, which means the master playback, slash 11.5, meaning queue 11.5. And I can say yes. And that has now deleted queue 11.5 for me. Great stuff. So that's how we can delete queues. You can also delete a range of queues. So I could say right now, for example, delete 7 through 10. And it's then going to say, are you sure you want to delete these queues? And I'm going to go and say yes. And that will allow you to delete multiple queues at once. I'm now in the situation where I've got a complete mess of queue numbers. I've got queues missing, I've got inserted queues as well, and if you want to, you can tidy that up. And you can tidy it back up to whole sequential queue numbers. To do that, we can go in the playback settings. To open the settings of a playback, hold setup and tap the playbacks button. And that will open the playback settings. Loads of information in here. We're not going to go in detail into all of this today. Go check out our other sessions for that. But we can go to advanced and we can go to renumber. And if you click that, you've then got the option to set your start number and the increment. And I can then click OK. And that's now renumbered that, starting at 1 onwards. And it's now tidied all of that up. Also, while I'm here, I might want to give the whole queue stack a name. So I'm going to call this my show. Click OK. I'm going to click OK. And now that playback has a name as well. So that's how we can renumber our queues if you need to as well. Now, the only thing that we haven't spoken about in this window is our queue settings. And every queue that you program into the console will have settings available to it. So let's take a look at those. If I click add, it allows me to add settings to that queue. So I'm going to go and add some settings to queue 2. And every queue you program will have these settings available to it. First of all, at the top, I can choose the trigger. What causes this particular queue to be triggered? And by default, it will be go, meaning a go button press will be required to run that queue. But if I open that drop down, I've got some other options. Firstly, I've got these auto options, auto with and auto after. If I say auto with, that means that this queue number 2, will run simultaneously with the previous queue. If I press go on the previous queue, this one will run as well. That allows you to have 2 things running on stage simultaneously. So you could, for example, have Q1 moving a bunch of movers over 5 seconds, Q2 could be moving a bunch of movers over 10 seconds, and both of those different things could run at once. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to say auto after, and that means that the first queue will run once its fade times have completed. The next queue will then run afterwards. When you've set an auto option, you can then set a wait time as well. So I'm actually going to say a wait time of 3 and click OK. Those settings that I've configured are then displayed in that queue settings button. So I'm going to go into Q1, and then my Q2 will run automatically afterwards. So let's see that again. Q1 runs through, the wait time counts down, and then my Q2 runs afterwards. I could then do the same for Q3. That could then also run automatically after the previous queue as well. And that means that I can start to have multiple queues all running one after the other if required. So that's something to be aware of. That's something that's quite useful to be aware of. As well as your auto options, if you're on the full-size Flex or some other consoles running Zeros, you will have real-time or MIDI. By real-time, we do literally mean a clock time, so 7 PM, for example. That's what we mean by real-time. If you're using that, make sure your console's clock is correct. Or we can use MIDI timecode. So if you're using a console with a MIDI input on the back of the console, you can go and configure a timecode. And that means that if the console receives a MIDI timecode clock of 1 hour, 1 minute and 50 seconds, and this particular queue is set to run at that time, it means that when the console receives that particular timecode clock, that queue will run for you. So it's a great way of synchronizing your cues to a audio track, for example. You could start the timecode clock at the same time as an audio track, and your cues can then be in sync with your audio track. So that is the MIDI trigger. I'm going to set that back to go though. Now what we also have in the cue settings is the option for don't move. So we could actually say, well, I don't want move on dark to prep colour. Remember I said, by default, the console will prep your colour, beam, shape and position information for your cue. Well, if I want to, I could say, well, in this particular cue, I don't want you doing that. So in this particular cue, I might want to say that I don't want my colour being prepared, for example. So I could go in to my cue settings and say don't move colour and click OK. And that means now when I go into that queue and my next queue runs, my colour didn't get prepped in that queue, and instead the console waited until the next opportunity that it could to prep the fixture's colour. So every queue you program will have the option for don't move options. Every queue you program can also have some macros associated to it. And by macros, we just mean the console doing something for you. So every queue you trigger every queue that you have on your console, when it runs, can also trigger one of these 3 things. It can trigger a macro, it could trigger a queue stack, or it could release a queue stack. So that is really useful for if you want to trigger a chase. Because I could say, yep, when I go into this particular queue, you could click add, and you could go and click a chase that you've got programmed in. I'm going to go and click on Q2. Playback number 2, sorry, and click OK. And that means that now, when I go into Q1, as well as Q1 being triggered, playback number 2 has also been triggered as well. I might actually then say, well, in queue number 3, I then want playback number 2 to be released or turned off. And so this time, playback number 2 gets triggered. When I then get to Q3, playback number 2 is then released. And then we go back to seeing just whatever was in Q3 when I programmed it. So every queue you program can trigger a macro, trigger a queue stack, or release a queue stack from running. Now, as I've been running the queue stack, you'll see here I've been able to click on a queue number I want. That changes what queue will become next. So if you click on a queue or tap on a queue, that queue then becomes next, meaning when you press the go button, you go straight to that queue. On Flex, you can also use the arrow keys as well. So I'm using my up and down arrow. That allows me to navigate this queue stack as well. If you press your go button, you'll go into that queue. If you press and hold shift and tap your go button, by default, that will snap you into that queue. So if you hold shift and tap your go button, that will snap into that queue, ignoring fade times. It will snap you straight into that queue, ignoring any fade times. Whereas pressing your go button will allow you to fade into that queue. Now, if I wanted to go straight into Q4 right now, or let's say I want to go straight into Q5, I could either, of course, click on 5 and then press go, or what I could do instead is press and hold my go button, and I get go to queue written in my command line. So I've got my go button held right now. I can type the queue number I need and then release my go button. So let's say I want to go straight to Q9 right now. Press and hold go. With the other hand, type the queue number you want to go to and then release your playbacks button. And you will then go straight to that queue. Now, another function that we have available to us is pause. So if you're on the full size Flex, you have a dedicated pause key. And that allows you to pause your queue transitions. If I press pause right now, you notice that my wait time has paused. I can then press go to resume that. Press pause again. That has paused my fade time transition. Press pause again. That will then act as a go back. So if you press pause twice, that will then act as a go back. And I can now go back up my queue stack. If you're on a FlexS console, you don't have a dedicated pause button, but instead you could configure the shifted go function to be pause. To do that, press and hold setup, tap your playbacks button, and you'll see here that you can hold shift, and if you do that, you can then see whatever the shifted button function is. So I can see right now that if I hold shift, go snap is the selected option, whereas I could hold shift, choose pause instead. And I'm then saying that when I hold shift, the go button will act as a pause. So that's how on FlexS you can also access the pause feature. And the pause can be used to pause fade time transitions, or can actually be used as a go back option as well. So that's the pause option, and the last thing that I want to talk about is speed override. Now, speed override can be found on your second encoder wheel. If you press your Z button on the console, your second encoder wheel is speed override. And speed override can be used as a way of speeding up or slowing down your cue transitions. So if I'm in Q4 right now, and I'm now going to go into Q5, I could actually first dial that encoder wheel clockwise, press go, and that will have sped up that transition. It hasn't edited the times, it's just purely overridden those times temporarily to speed up that transition. Equally, I could spin that wheel anti-clockwise to slow down my transitions if I want to. So I could then slow down these transitions. So that's really useful to be aware of. I'm going to go and go to Q3. Q3 releases my playback that's also running as well. And if I were to dial speed override fully clockwise, that gives me my go snap. So that's now giving me the same behaviour as if I did a shift and go. Whereas if I fully do that anti-clockwise, that will stop those transitions as well. So that's useful to be aware of. I'm going to go in and get rid of Q stack 2. And that will mean that my Q1 will no longer trigger playback number 2. And so that's speed override. So that's a really useful tool to allow you to speed up or slow down your cue transitions on the fly. Now, if you press the middle button of speed override, that will reset it back to the cue times, meaning those fade times can run through instead. So that's useful to be aware of. Speed override, as well as having it on an encoder wheel, you can set it up on an empty playback fader. So to do that, go to your faders window, click on an empty playback fader, and you can choose speed override. And that then allows this fader to be the speed override control. So you can raise that fader to speed up your cue transitions, or you can lower it to slow them down if required. So that's useful to be aware of. And that is everything that I wanted to go through today. That is our cue stack fundamentals. So we've taken a look there at recording our cues. We've looked at updating. We also looked about how we could name and adjust fade times. And we've also explored deleting, copying, and the cue settings as well. And we've also just there also taken a look at how we can play our cues back. So we can use the pause function. We can use the go to cue function as well. So I hope that's been useful. I hope that's been useful to take a bit of a dive and just look specifically at all of the functions that we've got available when it comes to actually recording a cue stack in particular, especially useful for theatrical playback, of course. If you've got any questions following this session, do please drop us an email, support@088.com, and we'll be able to get back to you. I hope you enjoyed the session and you found it useful. Any questions at all, as I said, please do get in touch, and I'll see you on the next session. Bye bye.